Welcome to the Midnight Library, a place where the night feels calm, the world slows down, and stories become a gentle pathway to rest. Find a quiet spot, settle in, and let your body sink into stillness. Breathe deeply in and out, leaving the day behind. This is your time to rest, your time to dream, your time to drift. And now, let us begin tonight's story.
The rain had been falling for hours, the kind of steady, unhurried rain that softened the edges of everything it touched. It whispered through the pines and pattered gently across the slate roof of an old house that sat at the end of a winding lane. The house had stood there for generations, its windows facing the valley below, its porch creaking softly as the night wind brushed by. No one knew exactly who had built it. It was said to have been passed from hand to hand, but the truth was that the house never really belonged to anyone. It simply waited for those who needed it. Inside, a single lamp burned near the window, casting a warm glow over a small sitting room. The scent of rain mixed with cedarwood drifted through the air. The curtains, pale and thin, moved ever so slightly with the rhythm of the weather outside. In a deep armchair near the window sat Clara. She had arrived only 2 days ago, a suitcase in one hand and a look of exhaustion in her eyes that no sleep could wash away. She had not planned to stay long. When she first found the house, tucked away beyond a curve in the road she didn't remember taking, she thought it was empty. The sign at the gate had been almost erased by time, its wooden letters faded, only the word welcome still legible. She had pushed the gate open and followed the stone path, the sound of her shoes mixing with the soft drizzle. And when she reached the porch, she felt something she hadn't felt in years, a sense of being quietly seen, as though the rain itself had led her there. Now she sat with her hands curled around a cup of tea, listening to the rain murmur against the windows. Each drop seemed to fall in rhythm, like a message written in sound. The old grandfather clock ticked softly in the corner, marking the slow passing of time that didn't seem to matter anymore. The fire in the small hearth had burned down to embers, casting faint shadows that moved like breathing across the walls. The house made sounds of its own. It creaked inside, as if it were alive, as if it were listening. The floorboards hummed faintly beneath her feet. The roof gave little moans when the wind brushed across it. And sometimes, if she sat quietly enough, she could almost swear she heard a heartbeat, a deep, soft drum somewhere in the walls, like the sound of the earth itself turning. She had come here without knowing why. The city had been too loud, too bright, too fast. Her days had turned into noise, her nights into restless wandering. One evening, she packed a few things, left a note on the kitchen counter of her apartment, and drove with no destination in mind. The rain began somewhere along the highway, and she followed it, mile after mile, until it led her here, to this house that seemed to exist outside of time. The first night, she had barely slept. She lay awake in the upstairs room, listening to the soft drumming of rain on the roof. The sound didn't disturb her, it wrapped around her like a lullaby. Somewhere in the darkness, she thought she heard a whisper, not words exactly, but something like the feeling of words. The sound was kind, gentle, like someone breathing near her, keeping watch. When she finally drifted off, she dreamed of water and candlelight, of voices carried on the wind. Now, on her second night, she was beginning to understand the rhythm of the house. It didn't ask questions. It didn't demand answers. It simply listened. It seemed to absorb every sigh, every pause, every silence. And when the rain fell, the house listened even more closely, as though the sound carried secrets from far away, secrets it had waited a lifetime to hear. Clara stood and walked toward the window. The world outside was blurred with silver mist. The rain fell steadily, soft but endless, turning the earth into a mirror. The garden was overgrown but beautiful in its wildness. Small lanterns hung from the branches of an old maple tree, their glass glowing faintly from the reflection of the indoor light. She pressed her palm against the cool windowpane and watched the droplets race each other down the glass. Each one made its own tiny sound, and together, they created a symphony that no composer could ever capture. She whispered, "You're beautiful," though she wasn't sure if she was speaking to the rain, the house, or the night itself. Somewhere deep within the walls, a faint creak answered her. It wasn't alarming, nor was it random. It was slow, deliberate, like the reply of something ancient and patient. Clara smiled faintly, though she didn't know why. She took another sip of her tea and returned to her chair. The cup was warm against her hands, the steam curling like a ghost toward the ceiling. She closed her eyes and let the rhythm of the rain sink into her. The house shifted, as though settling deeper into the earth. The sound of the roof gathering rain was like a heartbeat now, steady and soft. Clara's breathing matched it without effort. She thought of nothing, remembered nothing. She was simply there, wrapped in sound and silence, as if the world had finally stopped rushing. In another room, somewhere beyond the narrow hallway, a door clicked softly. The sound wasn't startling, it was tender, almost protective. Clara didn't move. She felt it more than she heard it. The air in the room seemed to hum, faintly alive, as if acknowledging her presence. She whispered again, though she didn't know to whom, "Thank you." The fire dimmed further, and the shadows deepened. The house exhaled, the rain softened, and time slipped quietly away. The rain continued through the night, slow and ceaseless, a patient companion to the quiet house. It fell in waves, sometimes soft enough to sound like breath, sometimes steady enough to sound like a heartbeat. The sound filled every corner, every crevice, every pocket of air between the old wooden beams. It was as if the world had been stripped of everything except that gentle music, that endless whisper of water meeting earth. Clara had never realized how much sound could hold. Every drop that touched the roof seemed to tell a story, and the house absorbed them all without interruption, holding them the way one might hold secrets too delicate to speak aloud. She stayed by the window long after the fire had gone out. The light from the lamp flickered softly, shadows dancing across the wallpaper like faint memories returning. Her reflection in the glass was half hidden by the raindrops, the candlelight behind her turning her outline into something ghostly and quiet. She didn't look tired anymore, not in the way she had when she first arrived. There was a softness in her face now, as though the rain had washed away some invisible weight she'd been carrying. When she finally stood and turned toward the hallway, the floor creaked beneath her feet. The sound blended seamlessly with the storm outside, as if the house and weather were breathing together. The air smelled of damp earth and faint lavender, a scent that clung to the walls and her skin. She moved toward the staircase, her fingertips trailing lightly along the wooden banister polished smooth by years of touch. The steps groaned gently as she climbed, but they didn't protest. They seemed to guide her, steady and sure, leading her upward toward the soft, muted light spilling from her room. Upstairs, the sound of rain changed. It was deeper here, more intimate, as if the roof were whispering directly to her. The window was open just enough to let the scent of wet leaves drift in. The curtains swayed slightly, brushing against the sill in a slow rhythm. She stood at the threshold, listening. The walls themselves seemed to hum, faintly resonant, tuned perfectly to the melody of the weather. She thought of her old apartment in the city, how even rain there sounded restless. It would pound against concrete, rush through gutters, and vanish too quickly. But here, it lingered. It took its time. It listened, and the house listened back. There was a strange comfort in that thought, the idea that something so simple could be so patient. She walked toward the small writing desk beneath the window. A candle sat there, half melted, its wax pooled like a tiny frozen lake. She lit it, and the room bloomed with soft gold. The flame flickered in response to the draft, and the shadows it cast moved like waves across the floor. On the desk lay a single notebook, the one she brought with her but hadn't touched since arriving. The cover was worn, the pages faintly yellowed at the edges. She ran her fingers over it, feeling the faint texture of the paper beneath her skin, and opened it to a blank page. She didn't know what to write. The words wouldn't come at first. But then the sound of the rain deepened, and something inside her shifted. Slowly, she began to write, not about herself, not about her past, but about the house. About the way it seemed to listen, the way its silence felt like comfort instead of emptiness. Her handwriting was slow, unhurried, as though the words were being whispered to her rather than thought. She wrote about the way the air seemed to glow when the lamps were lit. About the smell of cedar when the rain was heavy. About how the echoes in the hallways sounded like faint laughter, the remnants of people who might once have stayed here long ago. She wrote about how she'd arrived not by choice but by instinct, as though some quiet voice had called her name through the rain. And somewhere between one sentence and the next, she felt it again, that faint hum, low and steady, coming from the walls. It was soft, so soft that she almost thought she imagined it. But it was there, a vibration deep in the wood, as though the house itself were breathing with her. The flame of the candle swayed gently, and her pen slowed. She looked around the room, the corners wrapped in shadow. "I hear you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the patter of rain. For a moment, everything went still. The rain outside softened to a whisper, the air grew heavier, and the quiet pressed close. Then the floorboards beneath her gave a faint sigh, as if the house had heard her words and exhaled in response. Clara smiled. It wasn't frightening, it was tender, even familiar, like the moment a cat curls against your hand or the wind brushes past your cheek. She closed the notebook, the candlelight flickering across her face. She stood and crossed the room to the bed. The sheets were cool and smelled faintly of old linen and lavender. She slid beneath them, letting the sound of the rain gather around her like a blanket. The walls murmured quietly, the house settling once more. She felt it listening, every creak, every faint breath of air seemed to say, "You're safe here." Her eyes grew heavy, her breathing slowed. The candle burned low on the desk, its flame shrinking until it was only a small, steady glow. The last thing she heard before sleep took her was the rain, steady, rhythmic, endless, and beneath it, the faint, comforting heartbeat of the house. The morning came softly. Pale light spilled across the floorboards, brushing against the faded rug and the open notebook on the desk. The rain had stopped, but the world still felt damp, as if it were wrapped in a long exhale. Clara woke slowly, blinking into the quiet. The air was cool, the sky outside veiled in pale silver clouds. The silence was full, not empty, but alive, humming faintly with the memory of rain. She rose and dressed, her bare feet padding softly against the wood. Downstairs, the kettle sat waiting on the stove. When she lit the flame, the faint pop of heat filled the room, and soon, steam began to curl upward again. She poured water into a teacup and watched it cloud with warmth. The window panes were streaked with droplets, each one glimmering faintly in the soft morning light. She took her cup to the porch. The world outside was shimmering with freshness, the trees glistened, the path sparkled, and the air was heavy with the scent of wet grass. The sound of distant thunder lingered far away, rolling gently through the valley. She sat in the rocking chair and watched the mist drift between the trees. The stillness was so deep it felt sacred. She closed her eyes and listened again. Though the rain had stopped, she could still hear it, its echo living in the walls, its rhythm still pulsing through the house. It was as if the house remembered. Every drop that had touched its roof, every whisper that had passed through its halls, still existed in the quiet. It was a memory that would never fade, only soften with time. Clara took a slow breath, letting it fill her lungs. She realized she didn't feel lost anymore. The ache that had followed her for so long, the restlessness, the loneliness, the weight, had lessened. It hadn't vanished completely, but it had turned into something gentle, something she could carry without pain. The house had listened, and in doing so, had given her something she hadn't realized she'd been missing, stillness. She whispered softly to the morning, "I think I'll stay a little longer." The porch creaked beneath her, almost in response. Somewhere inside, the grandfather clock began to chime, slow and deep. The sound rolled through the house like the echo of rain. Clara sipped her tea, her gaze drifting toward the horizon. The world glowed faintly, washed clean. The wind carried the faintest murmur through the trees, and though the sky was clearing, the house still listened, always listening, waiting for the next storm to tell its stories again. The days that followed slipped by in a kind of waking dream, each one blending softly into the next. Clara moved through them quietly, like a ghost finding its rhythm in a place that had long been waiting. The rain came and went as if following her heartbeat, steady, unhurried, and always close. Some mornings, mist would rise from the earth, curling around the porch steps like smoke, and she'd sit with her tea, wrapped in an old wool blanket, watching the world appear and disappear in waves of silver fog. The house never demanded anything of her. It only offered warmth when she was cold, stillness when her mind was crowded, the sound of rain when silence grew too large. It had a language of its own, one she was slowly beginning to understand. At night, when the storms rolled in again, the house would hum faintly, and Clara would lie awake for a while listening. The sound wasn't frightening, it was almost maternal, like a lullaby murmur just under the surface of the world. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with the rhythm of the rain. She began to notice patterns in the way the sounds moved, the sighing of the beams, the faint tap of water dripping through the gutters, the whisper of wind sliding past the shutters. Together, they created something like music, a melody without an end. Sometimes she would speak aloud to the house, her voice soft in the darkness. She didn't ask questions or expect answers. It was more like talking to a friend who simply knew how to listen. "It's strange," she would say, her words fading into the dim light, "how quiet feels different here. It doesn't press on me anymore." And the house would creak, almost gently, as if nodding. One evening, she found an old photograph in the corner of the sitting room, half buried beneath a dusty cloth. When she lifted it, the faint smell of cedar rose into the air. Inside the drawer were several records, their labels faded, their surfaces etched with time. She chose one at random and set it on the turntable. When the needle touched down, a soft hiss filled the room, followed by the fragile notes of a violin. The music was slow, mournful, and beautiful. It seemed to wrap around the house like the rain did, curling through every corridor and finding every corner. She sat near the fireplace, watching the flames dance and the rain streak down the windows. The melody rose and fell like breath, and she could feel the house responding, the faint shift of air, the creak of the rafters, the sigh of the old wood. It was as if the house remembered this song, as though it had once been played here before, long ago. Clara closed her eyes and let herself drift. She imagined other lives that might have passed through these rooms, people who had sat where she sat, listening to the same rain, the same music. Maybe they, too, had come here to rest. Maybe the house had listened to their stories once, the way it listened to hers now. When the record ended, she didn't move to play another. The silence that followed was full enough. The rain continued its soft conversation against the roof, and she felt a peace so complete it almost ached. The clock ticked softly in the hallway, its rhythm steady and grounding. She thought about how strange it was that the simplest sounds, rain, wind, wood, time, could become a kind of healing. The next morning dawned gray and quiet. A soft mist clung to the ground, blurring the outlines of the garden and the trees beyond. Clara stepped outside, her boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The air was thick with the scent of pine and soil. She wandered toward the edge of the property, where the grass grew taller and wildflowers bent beneath the dew. From here, she could see the small creek winding through the woods, swollen from the rain. Its surface rippled gently, carrying leaves and reflections downstream. She crouched near the water's edge and dipped her hand into the current. It was cold and startling, but alive. She smiled faintly and whispered, "You sound just like the house." The creek gurgled in reply, soft and endless. As she walked back, she noticed details she hadn't before, the faint carvings along the porch railing, initials and dates etched into the wood by hands long gone. Inside, she found an old photograph tucked into a drawer in the kitchen. It showed two people standing on the very same porch, their faces half lit by sunlight, a dog sitting between them. The back of the photo had faded writing, "Summer, 1947. She stared at it for a long time. They looked happy, but there was something else in their expressions, a kind of knowing, a quiet understanding that this place held something more than walls and windows. Clara traced her finger over the image and smiled. "You must have loved it here too," she said softly. The days continued like that, gentle, unhurried, stitched together by small discoveries and long silences. Sometimes she would read by the window until the light faded. Other times she would walk through the house with her hands brushing along the walls, feeling the faint vibration beneath the surface. The more time she spent there, the more she understood that the house didn't just listen to the rain, it remembered it. Every drop, every storm, every quiet pause between, it held inside itself like music written in wood and stone. Then one night, the rain came harder than before. The wind rose, and the trees outside groaned under its weight. Thunder rolled far in the distance, low and deep. Clara sat in bed, her candle flickering wildly, watching shadows shift across the walls. The sound was immense, waves of rain hammering against the roof, wind pressing against the glass, but even through it, she could hear the hum of the house. It was steady, calm, as if whispering reassurance through the noise. The power flickered and went out, plunging the house into darkness. The candle flame wavered, nearly dying before flaring back to life. Clara stood and crossed to the window. Outside, the world was wild, branches whipping, water streaming down the glass. Yet inside, everything felt still. She could feel the pulse of the house through the floorboards beneath her feet. It was like standing inside a living heart, listening to it beat. She closed her eyes and let the sound fill her. "You've been through this before," she whispered, her voice lost in the roar. "You've heard storms like this, haven't you?" The house creaked softly, a slow, deliberate sound that rose from the beams above her and spread through the floor. She smiled. "Then I'll trust you." She sat down again, pulling the blanket tight around her shoulders. The wind howled outside, but she felt no fear. The rhythm of the storm began to change. What had once been chaotic now sounded almost like a lullaby, the thunder deep and rolling like a heartbeat in the distance. Hours passed like that, the world wrapped in rain and darkness. When the storm finally began to fade, the house exhaled, long and low, and everything settled once more. Clara drifted into sleep to the soft patter of the last drops on the roof, her breathing slow, her heart at peace. When she woke, sunlight poured through the windows. The air was bright and sharp, filled with the scent of wet pine and morning dew. She rose slowly, stretching, and felt an ache she hadn't known she carried finally ease. The house was quiet again, but its silence was no longer empty. It was full of warmth, of memory, of everything it had held through the night. She went to the window and opened it wide. The world outside sparkled, clean and new. The air was cool, but gentle, brushing against her skin like a promise. She whispered, "You kept me safe." And though there was no answer, she could feel the truth of it in the stillness that followed. The house had listened to the rain, and now it listened to her, too. It had always listened. And somewhere deep within its old wooden bones, she thought she heard the faintest echo of her own heartbeat joining its rhythm, steady and calm, as the morning light spilled across the floor. The day stretched on in a kind of serene stillness that Clara had come to treasure. The rain had stopped for now, but its presence still lingered in the air, in the smell of wet cedar and moss, in the faint glisten that clung to every leaf and branch outside the window. She brewed tea slowly, watching the steam curl upward in soft, silvery threads, catching the morning light. The house remained utterly still, its quiet no longer heavy but comforting, as if the rain had washed away all the noise of the world. When she stepped outside, the ground gave softly beneath her feet, damp and fragrant. The forest that framed the house was alive with tiny sounds, the drip of water from the canopy, the faint rustle of leaves, a distant bird calling somewhere deep within the woods. Every sound seemed sharper, more deliberate. It felt as if the entire landscape was breathing in rhythm with her. The house stood behind her, its windows gleaming faintly in the pale sun, its wooden frame still glistening from the night storm. She found herself walking further than usual, following a narrow path that wound down behind the property. The air was cool, the kind that wakes you gently but doesn't sting. It smelled faintly of pine needles and soil. After some time, she reached a small clearing she hadn't noticed before. There, in the center, stood a stone bench, worn and speckled with moss. A low wall circled it, crumbling at the edges, as if time had nearly forgotten it. The sight was so peaceful that she sat without thinking, her hand brushing away a thin layer of damp leaves. From here, she could see the house through a thin veil of mist. It looked smaller from this distance, yet somehow more alive. The gentle curve of the roof, the way ivy climbed the walls, the glint of water still sliding from the eaves, it was like the house belonged to the rain as much as it did to her. She closed her eyes and listened. Even though the storm had passed, she could still hear the faintest echoes of it in her mind, like a song that refuses to end. After a while, she returned to the house and found that the air inside was warm again. The fireplace, though long cold, still smelled faintly of smoke and oak. She lit a small fire and sat near it, her legs curled beneath her. She opened a book she'd found on a shelf in the sitting room, a collection of old poems written in looping, faded ink. The words were soft and melancholy, many about rain, rivers, and the passage of time. It felt almost too perfect, as if the house had chosen this book for her. Hours passed without her noticing. The light shifted from pale gold to a dusky amber, and the sound of distant rain began again, soft, gentle, like fingertips brushing against glass. She smiled and whispered, "You never stay away long, do you?" The rain responded by quickening slightly, the drops forming a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. When night returned, she lit a single candle and walked through the house. Each step echoed faintly, but not in an empty way. It was more like a conversation between her and the old floorboards. The shadows stretched long across the walls, moving slowly with the flickering flame. She found herself in the small hallway where she'd once noticed a crack in the plaster shaped like a lightning bolt. This time, she leaned closer and saw something faintly etched beside it, a few lines scratched into the surface, barely legible. It read, "Listen closely, for the rain remembers." Her breath caught for a moment. The handwriting was small, delicate, and clearly old. She traced her fingers over the words, the texture of the grooves rough under her skin. It sent a shiver through her, not from fear but from recognition, like reading something she already knew deep inside. The candle flame flickered, and the light made the writing seem to shift, the letters trembling slightly. She whispered the words again, softly, "The rain remembers." As she spoke them, the faint sound of droplets tapping against the window grew louder, as though the storm outside had been waiting for her to say it. She returned to her room, and the house hummed around her, faint but steady. The wind brushed against the roof, and somewhere a shutter clicked softly in the breeze. She pulled the blanket around her and watched the candle burn low. Sleep came slowly but deeply, the kind that feels like falling through warm water. In her dreams, she stood outside the house under a moonlit sky. The rain fell lightly, silver against the dark air, and she could hear voices in it, soft, distant, and kind. They didn't frighten her. They felt familiar, like old friends returning. The house stood behind her, its windows glowing faintly, and she knew it was listening too. The sound of the rain seemed to hold stories, whispers from lives that had come before her. Some of them were joyful, some sad, but all were gentle, wrapped in the same sound that now lulled her to rest. When she woke, dawn had already begun to bloom. The air was cool, and the world outside shimmered with light mist. The words she had seen on the wall lingered in her mind, quiet but constant. The rain remembers. It was a comforting thought, the idea that something so ordinary, so constant, could hold memories. She made tea again and opened the window wide. The air that came in was damp and fragrant, carrying the scent of soil and green things. The sound of light rain filled the room, and she realized she no longer felt alone in the quiet. The house had become more than shelter, it had become a companion. As the days passed, Clara began to write. Not for anyone else, not even for herself, but for the house. Each evening, after the rain began, she would sit by the window with her notebook and pen, writing down thoughts, fragments of dreams, or the way the rain sounded that night. She never read them aloud, but she always left the notebook open on the table before she went to sleep. One morning, she found the notebook moved slightly, the pages turned to a new one, though she didn't remember doing it. And on the fresh page, written in faint, spidery handwriting, were the words, "I hear you." Her hands trembled slightly as she read it, but she smiled. She didn't feel frightened. Instead, she felt an overwhelming calm. The rain had begun again outside, soft and slow, and she whispered into the quiet, "I hear you too." From then on, the house and the rain spoke to her in small ways. The door creaked open when she entered a room, as if in greeting. The wind would shift when she stood by the window, carrying the scent of faraway storms. Even when the rain stopped, she could feel the echo of it somewhere in the wood and stone, like the fading heartbeat of something alive and old. She stayed through the changing seasons. The rains grew lighter in summer, heavier again in autumn, and sometimes turned to soft snow in winter. But no matter the weather, the house always listened. And Clara, who had once come to escape the noise of the world, had found something deeper than silence. She had found a home that remembered, a home that spoke in the language of rain, and in its quiet rhythm, she found peace she had never known before. The world outside could rush and change, but here, time moved differently. Each drop of rain was a heartbeat. Each whisper of wind was a word. And every night, as she drifted into sleep, the house would hum softly around her, listening, remembering, and promising to keep her safe until morning. Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of the rain became the rhythm of Clara's life. The house settled around her like a blanket that remembered every fold and corner, every storm and silence. Mornings began softly, with the pale gray of mist pressed against the windows and the smell of damp earth drifting through the cracked panes. She would wake to the faint tapping of drops on the roof, the steady percussion that had become her comfort. There was no rush to leave her bed, no reason to break the stillness that waited like an unspoken prayer in every room. She had grown used to moving slowly, as if time itself had thickened in this place. Her tea brewed longer, her footsteps were quieter. The world outside existed, but it no longer called to her. Everything she needed was within the sound of the rain. Sometimes, when she lit a candle in the afternoon and watched the wax spill in lazy rivulets down the sides, she would think of how strange it was that peace could feel so heavy and full, like a silence you could rest inside. The nights were her favorite. They came quietly, the light dimming until it dissolved into the blue-black of evening. The first drops of rain would begin like shy introductions, soft taps against the roof, slow and uncertain, and then, as if recognizing her, they would settle into their steady rhythm. She would lie in bed listening, feeling as though the house itself had begun to breathe beside her. It wasn't loneliness anymore that filled the space. It was presence, deep and grounding. One evening, as she was closing the shutters in the kitchen, she saw something through the rain, a flicker of movement at the edge of the trees. A shape, faint and slow. It looked like someone walking, though the rain distorted the figure, stretching and bending it like reflection in water. For a long moment, she stood very still, the latch of the shutter cold against her fingers. The figure did not come closer. It paused near the tree line, as if listening. Then, slowly, it turned and faded into the gray mist. She waited, her breath shallow, but nothing more moved. When she finally exhaled, she realized her heartbeat had begun to echo the rain again, slow and calm. Whoever, or whatever, it was, it hadn't frightened her. It felt more like a reminder, a presence that belonged to this place as much as she did. Later that night, when the fire had burned low and the rain softened, she sat near the window and whispered into the stillness, "I saw someone tonight." The walls gave a small, almost imperceptible sigh, the kind one makes when it's listening. "Do you know them?" she asked. A beam above her creaked gently in reply, as if to say yes, but in a way you'll understand later." She smiled faintly, feeling the corners of her heart unfold a little more. There was no fear in the unknown here. Only patience. The following days were colder. The storms grew longer and steadier, filling the gutters and swelling the creek that wound past the house. The sound became constant, a curtain of water that separated her from everything else. She began writing again, small things at first. Lines about the way rain moved across glass. About the hush that came just before thunder. About the way loneliness could transform into peace when you stopped running from it. She wrote until her hands cramped, and when she finished, she left the pages on the desk near the window, knowing the house would see them. In return, it offered her tiny gifts. One morning she found a feather, pale gray and perfectly dry, resting on the windowsill, though the window had never been opened. Another evening, when she lifted a cushion on the porch, she found an old key, small, iron, worn smooth by years of touch. It didn't fit any lock she knew of, but she kept it on the table beside her bed. When she dreamed now, she often saw the rain from above. Endless silver threads connecting the sky to the earth, each drop carrying whispers she couldn't quite hear. In one dream, she walked barefoot through the wet grass behind the house, and each time a raindrop touched her skin, she could see a memory that wasn't hers, glimpses of a family laughing in the kitchen, a man playing a violin by candlelight, a child drawing on fogged glass. The memories shimmered and dissolved like breath. When she woke, the house was humming, as if remembering the same things. One afternoon, as the clouds thinned and sunlight poured through the trees, she decided to explore the attic. She hadn't been there yet, mostly because the door was narrow and stiff with age. When she pulled it open, a gust of cool, dry air greeted her, smelling faintly of dust and old cedar. The steps creaked under her weight as she climbed, each one releasing a tiny echo into the dim space above. The attic was larger than she expected. The light filtered in through a small round window, casting a pale circle on the floorboards. There were trunks stacked neatly along one wall, an old rocking chair draped with a thin sheet, and shelves lined with books whose spines had faded to near colorlessness. She opened one of the trunks carefully and found old linens, photographs, and letters tied with twine. The paper had yellowed and grown soft, but the ink remained legible. She untied one bundle and unfolded a letter. The handwriting was elegant and looping. "Dearest Eleanor, the rain hasn't stopped for 3 days, but I find it comforting now. The house listens. It always has. Sometimes I think it hums along with the storms, as if remembering every drop. If you return before the spring, you'll hear it too." Clara read the letter again and again. It was dated 1923. She held it for a long time, her eyes tracing the faded lines. Whoever wrote it had known what she knew now, the truth that the house wasn't just shelter, it was memory, alive in its own quiet way. She placed the letter back into the trunk, feeling the strange tenderness of connection across time. She imagined the writer sitting here, listening to the same rain, hearing the same low hum through the walls. It made her feel less like a visitor and more like part of a long, gentle story. That night, she lit candles in every room. The house glowed softly, the flames flickering and dancing with the rhythm of the rain outside. The air was rich with the scent of wax and damp wood. She sat in the parlor with her notebook and wrote to the house. "You remember them all, don't you? Every person who ever found their way here. You keep their stories in your walls. I think that's why you listened so closely." The fire crackled, and for a moment, She could almost swear she heard footsteps in the hallway, not heavy or hurried, but slow and calm, like someone taking a last walk through familiar rooms. She didn't move. She only smiled. "Good night," she whispered, and the footsteps faded. When morning came, the rain had stopped again. The sunlight slanted through the windows, soft and golden, and every surface glimmered with moisture. The house felt lighter, as though it had exhaled. Clara opened the front door and stepped out into the clean air. The forest sparkled, the creek murmured softly. She stood for a while, just listening. The silence was not empty, it was full, saturated with life and memory and sound too soft for words. For the first time in years, Clara felt as if she belonged somewhere, as if the quiet around her finally matched the rhythm within her. The rain began again, just a whisper, brushing against her face like a promise. She closed her eyes and smiled. The house listened, as it always did, and in the hush between raindrops, it seemed to breathe her name. The soft murmur of rain continued that evening, but something in its tone had changed. It wasn't simply background sound anymore, it felt like language, gentle and alive, as if the sky were trying to speak to her through the rhythm of water. Clara sat by the window, her tea untouched, eyes following each drop as it traced silver lines down the glass. She wondered if the rain was remembering too. Outside, twilight deepened into a velvet dusk, the kind that swallowed edges and shapes until only the faint glow of the lantern on her porch remained visible. Inside, the house was warm and breathing. She could feel it under her skin now, in the slow expansion of the wooden walls as they absorbed moisture, in the way the floors sighed when she crossed them barefoot. It was not just a structure anymore, it was an old friend, a guardian, a companion that hummed in sync with her heartbeat. When she lit the fireplace that night, the flames took their time before catching, as if waking from their own long dream. The scent of burning cedar filled the room, blending with the sweet damp of rain-soaked air that drifted through the cracks around the window frames. She curled under her blanket and let her thoughts drift, her eyes half closed, listening to the rise and fall of the storm's rhythm. In that half-dreaming state, she thought she heard a voice. Not loud, not distinct, just the soft timbre of someone humming an old tune she couldn't quite place. She didn't open her eyes right away. Instead, she let the sound wash over her, blending with the patter of rain and the occasional pop of the fire. When she did look toward the corner where the sound had seemed to come from, there was only the faint outline of her chair and the shifting play of light against the wall. She smiled to herself. It didn't scare her anymore when things like this happened. The house had become something she trusted, something kind. Every sound it made, every whisper that drifted through its rooms, carried the gentleness of familiarity. In the days that followed, she began to notice small changes. The air seemed to hold warmth even when the fire was out. The cracks in the window no longer let in drafts but soft sighs of the wind instead. The garden outside flourished in ways she couldn't explain, ferns unfurling overnight, moss deepening to a richer green. The rain had become part of her, and she part of the rain. One evening, she decided to walk beyond the edge of the forest, following the narrow path that wound past the old well. The air was thick with mist, curling around her like quiet breath. Her boots pressed softly into the damp earth, and every step echoed faintly in the hush. She didn't know what she was searching for, perhaps a sense of the story the house had been holding for so long. As she walked, the rain slowed, and she found herself in a small clearing she had never seen before. In its center stood a tree older than any she'd noticed nearby, its trunk wide and hollow, its branches heavy with lichen. She approached and saw, Just at its base, a cluster of smooth stones arranged in a small circle. They looked deliberate, like a marker. Kneeling, she brushed away the moss and found a carving faintly etched into the wood of the tree. It was the same looping script she'd seen in the letter from the attic, to those who listened. The words were almost worn away by time, but they glowed faintly when her fingers traced them, as though remembering the warmth of the last person who had done the same. She stayed there for a long time, feeling the steady rhythm of drops sliding through the canopy above. It was then that she realized the house didn't just listen to the rain. It listened through it. The rain was the messenger, carrying stories, memories, and whispers from those who had once loved, once wept, once laughed within its walls. It wasn't haunted. It was alive with remembrance. When she returned home, the house seemed to greet her more vividly than ever before. The fire kindled easily, the floorboards gave soft, familiar groans, and the faint humming began again from somewhere upstairs. She followed it slowly, holding a candle that trembled in her hand. It led her to the attic door. The same cool air slipped through the gap, tinged now with the scent of wet pine and faint lilac. She climbed the steps, her heart steady. The candlelight flickered across the trunks and shelves, catching on the mirror in the corner she hadn't noticed before. The surface was old, the glass wavy with age, but when she looked into it, she saw not only her own reflection but faint outlines of others, faces blurred by time, smiling softly. They weren't ghosts, not in the way she had once feared such things. They were memories, impressions of those who had loved the house, who had listened to the same rain. One of the faces, a woman with her hair pinned up, seemed to mouth words. Clara leaned closer, her breath misting the glass. She couldn't hear them, but she understood them anyway. The message wasn't meant to be spoken aloud, it was felt. You are home now. Tears rose in her eyes, not from sorrow, but from the depth of something she hadn't realized she'd been missing all her life. Belonging. She pressed her hand against the cool glass, and for a fleeting moment, she felt warmth on the other side, as if someone's hand met hers in quiet understanding. From that night on, Clara lived in harmony with the house and the rain. She spoke to it freely, leaving the windows open to let the voices of the storms flow through. When she cooked, she set an extra cup on the table, just to feel the completeness of company. When she wrote, she left her pages on the windowsill, knowing that the rain would read them before the ink dried. Seasons began to change, and with them, the rain took on different songs. In spring, it danced, light, bright, playful. In summer, it whispered, tender and slow. Autumn brought longer, thoughtful rains that carried the scent of falling leaves, and winter storms came heavy and deep, echoing through the chimney like a lullaby. Years later, when visitors occasionally passed through the valley and asked about the old cottage by the creek, the locals would smile and shake their heads. That place, they'd say. It listens when it rains. Always has. And though no one had seen Clara for years, the chimney still smoked gently on rainy days, and sometimes, when the wind carried just right, people swore they could hear a soft humming, a tune without words, drifting through the mist. Inside, the house stood warm and aglow, its walls filled with quiet joy. The rain fell as it always did, tapping softly on the roof, telling its stories to the one who still listened. The light never went out completely, it flickered faintly through the windows, steady and kind. And somewhere in that endless symphony of rain and wood and memory, Clara's voice joined the others, calm, loving, eternal, woven into the song the house had always known how to sing. The rain had been falling for days without pause, soft and endless, the kind of rain that seemed to dissolve the edges of time itself. Each drop carried with it a melody that wrapped around the house, filling it with a rhythm too delicate to describe. It was as if the world beyond had been washed away, leaving only the hush of the storm, the gentle creak of the old beams, and Clara's steady breath as she moved through the dim rooms. The world outside had grown distant, blurred by mist and memory, and yet inside the house, everything felt sharper, more alive. She sat by the window again that night, watching how the lantern light shimmered across the puddles forming in the yard. The rain's reflection danced, a trembling glow that reminded her of candle flames seen through tears. The house breathed with her, she could feel it. The walls expanded slightly with the damp, the wood alive beneath her fingers. Sometimes she imagined she could hear the house murmuring back, its timbers whispering secrets too ancient for words. The sound was comforting, never frightening. The house didn't want to haunt, it wanted to remember. She could feel its history in the rhythm of the rain that always seemed to fall harder when she felt lonely, softer when she closed her eyes to sleep. It was as if the weather itself had learned her heartbeat and matched its pace to hers. Clara began to notice small things changing around her. The clock in the hallway, long broken, began ticking softly at night though its hands didn't move. The air in the rooms carried a faint scent of lilac even when no flowers were near. Sometimes, she would wake in the middle of the night to find the fire still burning low, though she hadn't touched it in hours. There was a presence here, gentle, watchful, tender. She no longer feared being alone. The loneliness she had once carried like a stone in her chest began to ease, replaced by a deep quiet that felt almost sacred. She realized that she was being kept company in ways unseen, that every whisper of rain against the window was a voice, every sigh of wind through the chimney a word of comfort. The house wasn't just listening to the rain, it was listening to her too. On one such night, she woke to the faintest hum, a lullaby she couldn't quite place, low and wavering, as if sung from another room. She didn't move at first, only let the sound fill the dark around her. The melody was slow, almost sorrowful, but there was warmth in it, too. It reminded her of her mother humming by the hearth long ago, before the world had turned quiet. She rose and followed the sound through the house. Her bare feet brushed against the cool floorboards as she climbed the stairs. The air was cool but kind. The hum grew stronger near the attic door, that same door she'd once been afraid to open. She didn't hesitate this time. When she stepped inside, the moonlight fell through the small window in silver streaks, touching the dust and trunks that lay beneath it. The sound stopped when she entered, but the silence it left behind was full, not empty. She ran her hand along the trunk where she found the old letter. The wood was damp, but beneath her touch it felt alive, pulsing faintly, as though echoing the rain outside. She could feel a warmth there, the faint memory of hands that had rested in the same place decades before. Something in her shifted then, a realization that this wasn't about haunting or mystery. It was about connection, about echoes that lingered in places too kind to forget. The rain, she understood, carried messages from the past, from all who had lived within these walls, loved within them, wept within them. It carried memories the way a stream carries fallen leaves, never quite letting them go. She whispered a thank you to the quiet air and returned downstairs, her heart light. When she reached the parlor, she found the window had fogged over. In the glass, faint lines had formed, as if traced by invisible fingers. It looked like a pattern, almost like writing. She leaned closer, and though the message was faint, she could just make out 3 words, "You are heard." The rain fell harder then, as if in response, and Clara laughed softly, tears blurring her vision. She pressed her palm to the glass, and though it was cold, she felt a pulse beneath it, steady and reassuring. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was talking to herself. The days that followed were filled with the rhythm of gentle rain and quiet discovery. She found small objects in odd places, a child's marble under the stair, a rusted key behind the shelf, a pressed flower between pages of an old book. Each seemed to hum faintly when she touched it, carrying its own small story. She began to piece together the lives that had passed through the house. A family who had built it from cedar and stone. A child who had loved the sound of storms. A woman who had waited for someone who never returned. The rain remembered them all, and now, it remembered her too. Sometimes she would sit outside beneath the porch, wrapped in a shawl, letting the rain mist against her skin. The house would creak beside her, and the earth would give off the scent of renewal. She began to write again, letters to no one, stories for the rain to read. When she left the pages on the windowsill, they were always gone by morning, but she didn't mind. She liked to think they had been carried away by the weather, whispered into the wind for someone else to find. Autumn came and turned the forest gold. The rain thinned but never stopped, only changed its voice. It no longer spoke in constant rhythm but in gentle murmurs, pauses between drops like quiet breaths. Clara had learned to understand those pauses. She could hear the difference between longing and comfort in the tone of the rain now, between joy and remembrance. When winter arrived, the world around the house grew silent. Snow blanketed the roof, and icicles hung like glass chimes from the eaves. Inside, the warmth of the fire painted everything in amber. The rain had turned to snow, but the house still listened. The flakes made no sound as they fell, but their silence spoke in its own way, soft and endless. One night, as the snow fell thick and the fire burned low, Clara sat by the window and whispered her gratitude. "You've kept me safe," she said softly, unsure if she was speaking to the house or the rain or something greater that bound them both. "You've listened." A faint echo moved through the room then, so soft she might have imagined it. "Always." Her eyes filled with tears, not of sorrow but of something deeper, something close to peace. She smiled and leaned her head against the windowpane, feeling the faint chill of the night seep through. The sound of the snow was still there, steady and eternal. The house breathed once more, its warmth steady, its heart still beating. In the years that followed, the locals spoke of the woman who lived in the house that listened to rain. They said she had found a way to speak to storms, that the lights in her windows never went out even during the harshest winter. And though they rarely saw her, they swore that the air around the cottage always smelled faintly of cedar and lilac, and when the rain came, it sang softly, songs that made you want to close your eyes and dream. And if you were to walk past that house on a rainy night, and listen very closely, you might still hear her voice within the storm, humming that same old tune. The one that sounds like memory. The one that sounds like home. The house had become her companion in every way the world had failed to be. Days folded gently into nights, and the line between dreaming and waking grew faint. Clara's life outside, the rush of subways, the glowing screens, the endless questions of what next, faded into something that no longer held weight. Here, she existed inside a hush, a lullaby of raindrops and sighing wood, a rhythm that felt almost like breathing with another soul. The house listened, and in turn, it taught her how to listen too. Sometimes, when the weather turned fierce, when the thunder rolled far off across the valley, she would walk slowly from room to room, her fingertips brushing against the walls. Each touch sent a faint tremor through the air, as though she was completing a circuit. The sound of the rain grew richer in those moments, the drops against the roof forming chords that rose and fell with her movement. She began to hum softly as she walked, not a song she knew but something the house seemed to understand. When she paused, the rain paused too, waiting. Then, as she began again, the rhythm would follow her steps, a duet between the living and the listening. There was a mirror in the hall that she hadn't noticed before, framed in oak carved with shapes that looked like waves. One afternoon, when the clouds thinned and the rain lightened to a mist, she stood before it. Her reflection looked softer somehow, less weary, her eyes calm in a way they hadn't been in years. Behind her, the dim room shimmered faintly, as if a veil had lifted. For a moment, she thought she saw another figure standing near the window, a woman in an old-fashioned dress, her hair pinned neatly, her hands folded. The figure wasn't frightening, she looked gentle, patient. Clara blinked, and the image was gone, leaving only her own face, but something inside her stirred, a recognition she couldn't explain. That evening, as she wrote by the fire, she found herself addressing the woman in the mirror. "You were here before me," she whispered, her pen hesitating above the paper. "You loved this place too, didn't you?" The rain answered with a single long sigh against the glass, like breath fogging the edge of memory. The letter she wrote that night wasn't meant for anyone to read. It was a conversation written in quiet ink, about grief and stillness, and the small ways a person could begin again. When she finished, she left the folded page on the mantel. The next morning, it was gone, replaced by a single pressed flower, pale and perfect. She held it for a long time, feeling the faint texture of its veins against her skin, and whispered a thank you that melted into the air. With each passing day, the boundary between herself and the house blurred further. She began to wake before dawn, sensing the first soft breaths of rain even before they fell. She could tell when the wind would turn, when the storm would swell or fade. Sometimes she'd step outside in her bare feet, standing on the wet porch, and the rain would fall more gently, almost as though it recognized her. The earth smelled of pine and something deeper, something clean, reborn. She stopped keeping track of the days. There was only the cycle of rain and quiet, of sleep and soft waking. The house seemed to change with her mood. When she felt lonely, the firelight lingered longer, and when she felt content, the air filled with warmth and a faint hum like distant singing. At times, she caught herself whispering without meaning to, speaking to the air as if to a friend sitting just out of sight. And when she did, the rain always seemed to lean closer, listening. One night, the storm outside grew wild. Lightning rippled through the sky, but instead of fear, Clara felt a deep calm, as though she were part of the storm's heartbeat. The windows rattled, the roof groaned, yet inside, every sound was softened by the steady hum of the house. She sat on the floor by the window, knees drawn up, and watched the flashes light the horizon. The trees bent and swayed, and in that dance, she felt the pulse of something vast and forgiving. When she finally drifted to sleep, her dreams were clear and gentle. She saw the same woman from the mirror standing in the garden beneath the rain, her dress glowing faintly in the stormlight. The woman looked up at the window where Clara watched and smiled, a slow, knowing smile that reached her eyes. Then she pointed to the earth at her feet, where flowers bloomed despite the downpour, their petals catching droplets like jewels. When Clara awoke, the vision stayed with her like a promise she didn't need to understand. Days later, she found that very patch of garden behind the house. The soil was soft and dark, the rain still falling in fine misty lines. She knelt and pressed her hands into the earth, feeling the cool dampness seep through her fingers. It felt alive, awake. When she stood, her palms left perfect impressions that filled slowly with water, and she watched as the ripples formed delicate patterns, like words too ancient for speech. She smiled then, realizing she didn't need to leave. The world beyond the gate no longer called to her. Here, she had found what so many people spent their lives searching for: quiet that didn't ache, solitude that didn't sting. The rain had become her companion, her confidant, her lullaby. The house was no longer a shelter, it was home. As spring arrived again, the valley grew lush and green, but the rain never truly stopped. It lingered in the mornings, in the evenings, always whispering to her through the glass. Clara's hair turned silver with time, but her eyes held the same gentle calm. The locals said the woman in the house at the end of the lane had a way of calming storms, that she could make the clouds linger or fade with a single hum. They said the rain near her home always sounded like a song. And perhaps, on certain nights, when the world was hushed and the sky hung heavy with mist, travelers passing through could hear the faint murmur of voices beneath the sound of rain. A woman's laughter, soft and content, and the answering sigh of a house that had waited lifetimes to be heard. The rain kept falling. The house kept listening. And somewhere inside, Clara's voice joined the weather, steady, endless, and kind, a sound that carried peace through the valley long after she was gone. The seasons passed with the same softness that filled the house. Summer came quietly, as though it was careful not to disturb the rhythm of rain that had become part of everything. The days stretched longer, but the light remained diffused by the mist that hovered over the valley. The air outside grew warmer, heavy with the scent of wet grass and earth, and yet the rain never truly left. Sometimes it came as a fine drizzle, other times as a deep evening downpour that wrapped the house in music. Clara had stopped longing for blue skies. She found more beauty in the grayness, in the way the rain blurred edges and made every sound feel round and close. Each morning, she woke to the soft patter of droplets against her window. She would lie still for a long while before opening her eyes, listening to the melody change as the wind shifted. Every storm had its own language, its own mood. Some mornings the rain sounded like distant bells, others like whispered laughter. The house responded to it too, its timbers expanding and contracting, sighing as though it breathed with her. The old floorboards no longer startled her when they creaked. They spoke, in their way, of settling and safety. Sometimes she spent hours in the kitchen, baking bread just to fill the rooms with warmth. The smell of rising dough mingled with the scent of rain-soaked pine and the faint sweetness of lilac that always lingered near the window. She would eat by the light of a single candle and talk softly to the house, telling it about the dreams she barely remembered or the memories that surfaced like old photographs drifting up through water. The house never replied in words, but it always answered, in the shift of air, in the way the flames steadied when she spoke, in how the rain softened its rhythm when she sighed. She found an old record player in the attic one afternoon. Its case was covered in dust, the needle bent, but after cleaning it and setting it by the window, she discovered that it still worked. The first record she played was cracked, but the sound that came through was haunting, violins faded by time, a melody so fragile it felt like it could break if she breathed too hard. The rain outside slowed as if listening, matching its rhythm to the old music. The moment was small but profound. It felt as though the past and the present had met in that single sound, two ghosts recognizing each other. That night, the air was so still she could hear the rain striking the leaves in the garden one by one. She went outside barefoot, stepping onto the cool earth, feeling it sink slightly beneath her weight. The world glistened silver under the thin light of the moon. Every raindrop caught the glow and reflected it back like 1,000 tiny lanterns. She tilted her head to the sky, closed her eyes, and let the water trace her face, her neck, her hands. The sensation wasn't cold, it was grounding, familiar, a reminder that she was alive and part of something vast and kind. She began to sleep deeply again, her nights no longer haunted by city noise or worry. Sometimes her dreams carried her to strange places, a coastline of endless rain, a hallway made entirely of mirrors, a garden where every flower whispered her name. In those dreams, the sound of rain was always there, steady and patient. It followed her like a friend walking just behind. When she woke, she could still feel it, not outside her window, but within her pulse. There were times she wondered if anyone else could ever understand the bond she felt with this place. Friends had written letters months ago, asking where she'd gone, why she'd left without a word, but she hadn't replied. It wasn't that she didn't care, it was that there was nothing to explain. The life she'd stepped into was quieter, slower, more real than words could ever describe. It wasn't a retreat from the world. It was the world she had been searching for all along. In late summer, a stranger came to the door. He was a traveler, soaked to the bone, his hat dripping water onto the porch. Clara opened the door before he could knock. The house seemed to recognize him somehow, the air shifted, the rain softened. He spoke gently, apologizing for disturbing her, asking if he might wait out the storm. She nodded and led him to the fire. He was young, perhaps 30, though his eyes carried a tiredness she knew well. They spoke little at first. The crackle of the fire filled the space between them. When he finally asked her how long she'd lived there, she paused before answering. "I'm not sure anymore," she said. "Time feels different here." He smiled faintly and nodded, as though he understood. They shared tea and quiet conversation until he fell asleep by the fire. In the morning, he thanked her, his clothes dry, his face calm. Before leaving, he said, "I thought I was lost last night. But this place, it feels like it listens." Clara watched him disappear down the rain-soaked lane, his figure fading into mist. That was the last time anyone ever came to the house, though she often thought of him afterward. She liked the idea that maybe, somewhere, he had found peace too. As years folded quietly into one another, Clara grew older. Her hair turned the color of the clouds, her hands more delicate, her steps slower. But her eyes, those eyes remained bright, reflective, always full of light. The rain still sang, and she still listened. She had long stopped wondering about who had lived here before or what the house might have once been. It didn't matter. What mattered was the companionship of sound and silence, the steady presence that had held her for so long. On the night she felt her strength fading, the rain began again, soft, rhythmic, familiar. She lit a single candle and sat by the window, wrapped in a blanket. The world outside glowed faintly under the curtain of rain. Every sound was precise, clear, as if the storm itself wanted to be remembered. She rested her hand against the glass, feeling the faint vibration of water meeting window. Her lips curved into a gentle smile. "I'm still here," she whispered. "I'm listening." The house exhaled once more, deep and slow. The rain fell in harmony with her breathing. And when at last her eyes closed, the storm outside did not rage, it whispered. It carried her softly, tenderly, like a song fading into the distance. In the years that followed, travelers still passed the end of that lane. Some claimed they saw light in the upper window on rainy nights. Others swore they heard the faintest hum carried on the wind, a woman's voice woven into the music of the rain. Those who lingered long enough said they felt watched, but kindly, like the way the rain watches over the earth. They called it the house that listens to rain, though none remembered who named it first. It became a place of quiet legend, where people came not for answers, but to feel heard, to stand in the stillness and let the world's noise fade away. And even now, when the storms drift over the valley and the windows glow faintly gold, the rain still sings its old familiar song. If you listen closely, if you stand perfectly still, you might hear it too. The sound of peace. The sound of memory. The sound of a house, still listening, after all this time. The house continued to live, long after time had begun to forget it. The valley cradled it like a memory it refused to let fade. Moss grew thick along the stones of the garden wall, and the vines that had once timidly reached for the eaves now wrapped around them completely, tenderly, as if holding the house close. Every surface carried the soft patina of years, and yet nothing about the place felt abandoned. The air still hummed faintly with warmth, the scent of rain and lilac lingering like a soul that had chosen not to leave. Sometimes the rain came in the gentlest of forms, just a whisper over the roof tiles, too delicate to be seen, only felt as a breath on the skin. Other times it arrived in grander fashion, sweeping across the valley in silver sheets that blurred the trees and made the horizon dissolve. The sound it made against the windows was always different, sometimes playful, sometimes mournful, but always filled with a strange, patient love. To anyone who stood outside, it felt as if the rain itself was aware of the house, like two old friends continuing an endless conversation. Inside, the rooms had become still sanctuaries of sound and silence. The old clock on the wall no longer kept perfect time, but it didn't matter. Its soft ticking was like a heartbeat that had slowed to match the rhythm of rain. In the evenings, when mist gathered thick around the valley and the candles burned low, the shadows in the corners lengthened, but never in a frightening way. They moved gently, like dancers swaying to a rhythm only the rain could compose. It was as though the house had absorbed all the loneliness and turned it into quiet comfort, every sigh of the wind against its walls transformed into a lullaby. If you stepped into the kitchen, you would still find traces of Clara's life. The teapot rested on the shelf by the window, a faint crack running through its spout. A book of pressed flowers lay open on the table, the pages yellowed, the petals perfectly preserved as though the air itself had protected them. Near the hearth, an old shawl hung from a chair, its fabric soft and faintly scented of wood smoke. And on the mantel, beside the melted candles, sat a small silver locket. Inside it was a photo, Clara, young and bright-eyed, her smile serene, holding a cup of tea as if toasting the listener. Whoever came across it could almost imagine her still sitting nearby, waiting for the next storm to roll in. The nights in the valley were long, filled with a deep, velvety darkness that carried sound for miles. When the wind came down from the mountains, it brought with it the smell of pine and the faint, metallic scent of snow. The house would creak softly in greeting, the rain tapping out its gentle rhythm on the roof. To those who wandered near, it sounded like the house was humming, a low, tender hum that wrapped itself around the heart and settled into the bones. Travelers who stayed long enough spoke of strange dreams, vivid and calm, where they stood beside an unseen woman in a field of wet grass while the rain whispered secrets only she could translate. They awoke rested, their minds clear, their hearts lighter, as if something heavy had been lifted away during the night. There were rumors too, stories told by locals in the nearby town. Some said the house could only be found when it wanted to be, that it sometimes disappeared beneath the rain, invisible until the storm had passed. Others claimed that the rain around the house never truly stopped, even when the rest of the valley was dry. Children dared each other to walk the path at dusk, and though few ever did, those who tried said they could hear faint laughter carried by the wind, like the echo of someone remembering joy. It wasn't a place of fear, they all agreed. It was something gentler, something sacred. One autumn, a rider arrived, seeking solitude. He had heard of the house in passing, dismissed it as local folklore, yet one night he found himself driving through the valley as rain began to fall. The road curved unexpectedly, and there it was, a small light glowing faintly through the mist. He stopped, drawn by a quiet curiosity. The door opened easily, as if expecting him. Inside, everything felt impossibly warm, the scent of rain and wood smoke embracing him at once. He lit a fire, made tea from the leaves he found on the shelf, and sat by the window watching the downpour. Hours passed, and yet he did not feel the urge to leave. It was as though the house had reached into his restlessness and smoothed it away. He stayed for weeks, writing by candlelight, his words slow and soft. He never felt alone, even though no one ever came. Sometimes, in the corner of his eye, he thought he saw movement, a shadow brushing past the doorway, a flicker of white by the stairs. He never turned to look fully. It didn't frighten him. It comforted him, like the awareness of someone sitting quietly beside you in shared silence. When he finally left, his notebook was full of stories that he couldn't quite explain. He left a letter on the mantel, addressed simply, "For Clara, who listens." Seasons changed again. Snow began to fall, blanketing the world in stillness. The rain paused for a time, resting, replaced by the slow descent of flakes that shimmered in the pale light. The house stood quiet, wrapped in white. But beneath the snow, deep within the earth, the sound of water moving never ceased. Even in silence, the rain lived on. When spring came and the thaw began, it returned with gentle insistence, flowing over the stones, through the gutters, along the roof, filling the air with its familiar voice. Years blended into decades. The world beyond the valley changed, towns grew, roads widened, but the lane that led to the house remained untouched. Occasionally, travelers still found their way there. A lost hiker, a weary musician, a woman fleeing noise and confusion, all stumbled upon it when they needed it most. They always spoke of how the rain seemed to guide them, the sound growing stronger as they drew nearer. And when they left, they always looked back once, certain they felt eyes upon them, not watching, but wishing them well. No one ever stayed forever, but everyone who visited carried something of the place with them. They would wake years later to a rainstorm and feel the same peace, the same sense of being known. They would remember the way the water had sounded against the glass, how it seemed to echo their thoughts without needing words. And sometimes, when they spoke of it to others, their voices softened, as if afraid that speaking too loudly might break the fragile beauty of the memory. Now, if you were to walk through that valley on a gray afternoon, you might hear the rain before you saw the house. It would come as a hush, a lullaby sung by the earth itself. You'd follow it, your heart slowing with each step, until the outline of the house appeared through the mist. You might stand there for a while, listening, realizing that the rain was not falling on you but around you, as though it recognized your presence and welcomed it. The air would feel warmer there, the kind of warmth that lives inside old, kind things. and if you were to place your hand against the door, you'd feel it vibrate faintly, not from wind or thunder, but from the sound of rain moving through wood, through memory. The door would open gently, the air inside sweet and still, and for a moment, you might think you heard a sigh of recognition. You'd step in, and time would slow. You'd feel the walls hum softly, the same way a shell hums with the sound of the sea. You'd find yourself smiling for no reason at all. The rain outside would continue its patient song, just as it always had. The house would breathe around you, quiet and eternal, listening to every heartbeat, every breath, every unspoken word. And somewhere in the hush between raindrops, if you listened closely enough, you might hear her voice, gentle, warm, timeless, whispering, "You're home." The rain deepened that night, steady and rhythmic, falling in long silvery curtains that turned the world outside into a moving watercolor. Inside the house, the fire in the hearth burned low, its glow soft and amber against the wooden walls. The air smelled faintly of cedar and smoke, the kind of scent that settles into your clothes and lingers, comforting and familiar. The windows fogged at the corners, catching reflections of the flickering flame. If you listened closely, the house seemed to breathe in time with the rain, the timbers expanding and settling with each sigh of the wind, as though it were alive, aware, and utterly at peace with the passing of time. The rain had always known the house, just as the house had always known the rain. Their companionship was ancient and quiet, one made of sound and silence, touch and memory. When storms gathered over the valley, thunder rolling like slow music across the hills, the house did not tremble. It listened. The sound of each drop against its roof was like a note in an endless song, one that had been playing since long before people came and would continue long after they were gone. The walls held stories, the laughter of those who had once danced in the parlor, the whispered goodbyes of travelers who found warmth there, the solitary hum of a woman who spent her life tending to it, speaking softly to the rain as though it were her oldest friend. There had been nights when the rain came so heavy it drowned out the world. The path to the house disappeared, the forest became a blur, and the sky melted into the earth. But still, the house remained, a warm light behind its windows, a steadfast figure in the storm's embrace. The rain would wrap around it, tracing the shape of its roof, running down the window panes like tears that carried no sadness, only tenderness. It wasn't mourning anything. It was remembering. Some believed the rain carried voices. Not in the way of ghosts, but like echoes of thoughts left behind. The sound of water on the roof could resemble laughter, or the murmur of someone reading aloud, or the hush of a lullaby sung to no one in particular. Those who stayed in the house long enough began to hear patterns in the rainfall, gentle rhythms that seemed to align with their heartbeat. It didn't matter how restless they had been before, sleep would come easily, dreams arriving like visitors stepping quietly into candlelight. The valley itself held a strange kind of peace. Mist drifted low over the fields, curling through the trees like ribbons. The river at the edge of the woods always mirrored the color of the sky, sometimes a deep steel gray, sometimes silver, sometimes the faintest gold at dawn. Deer would emerge in the mornings, their coats damp with dew, pausing to listen to the soft echo of dripping leaves. Everything there seemed to move in slow motion, as though even time itself had learned to whisper. In that stillness, the house seemed less a building and more an emotion given form. It was solitude without loneliness, quiet without emptiness. It was what people sought but rarely found, a place where silence didn't demand anything, where one could simply exist. Many who visited didn't realize how much they had been searching for that until they arrived. The writer who stayed there once described it perfectly in a note he left behind. The house does not speak, but it answers. The rain does not ask, but it understands. At times, the rain would taper off, and the world would hold its breath. The last drops would slip from the eaves and fall into puddles that rippled outward in slow, lazy circles. Then came the sound of water retreating into the soil, a hush so soft it felt sacred. The air would shimmer faintly, cool against the skin, scented with pine, moss, and something else, something faintly metallic and sweet, like memory itself. During those moments of pause, sunlight would occasionally pierce through the clouds, illuminating the valley in fractured gold. Steam would rise from the stones, curling like smoke, and the entire landscape seemed to exhale. Birds returned, cautious at first, their songs fragile and clear. The house glowed under this light, its wet walls glistening, its windows catching fragments of the sun like mirrors of warmth. Yet even then, you could still hear the rain's ghost, a soft drip here, a whisper there, reminding the world that it was never truly gone. Inside, the house remained a sanctuary. The books on the shelves held swollen edges from years of humidity, their pages slightly curled but fragrant with the scent of ink and dust. The old armchair near the fire had been worn smooth where hands had rested, where bodies had leaned back to read or to dream. The wooden floor creaked with every step, but never sharply. It was more of a sigh, the sound of wood that had listened to footsteps for so long it had learned to echo affection rather than complaint. On the far wall hung a single painting, a woman in a raincoat standing beneath a black umbrella beside a lake. Her face was turned away, lost in the mist. No one remembered when it had been hung there, or who had painted it, but it seemed to belong to the house as much as the windows and doors did. When lightning flashed outside, it would illuminate her form briefly, giving the illusion that she was moving, walking slowly into the fog. Some said the house was hers, that she was Clara, the listener who had once lived here, who had never really left. On certain nights, when the rain fell softly and the air felt thick with sleep, you might sense her presence. Not as a ghostly shape or shadow, but as a warmth in the room, a weight beside you that didn't frighten, only calm. You might hear the faint rustle of fabric, the clink of a cup being set down, the almost imperceptible hum of someone thinking. And if you whispered something, anything at all, you might imagine the rain answering, carrying your words into the walls where she could hear them. The air would change, the way it does when someone smiles unseen. As the years stretched on, the house began to appear in fewer maps, yet it was never forgotten. It became something that lived in stories told by travelers, stories shared in quiet cafes, in letters, in bedtime whispers. There's a house in the valley that listens to the rain, they'd say. If you find it, don't be afraid. Just listen back. Some went looking for it, and some found it without trying. It seemed to reveal itself only to those who needed to hear something, to remember something they'd forgotten. And so the legend continued, carried on raindrops, in the hush between storms, in the sound of water trickling down gutters and streams. The house was no longer just a place. It was a rhythm, a song, a patient ear to the endless music of the world. When rain fell anywhere, in cities, on balconies, on lonely highways, perhaps a small part of it still remembered that valley, that house, that promise of stillness. If you stood in your own home tonight, listening to rain against your window, you might catch that same gentle cadence. You might feel the air thicken slightly, warmer, softer. You might even imagine a distant heartbeat echoing through the sound, the pulse of an old wooden house somewhere far away, still listening, still alive, waiting for the next voice to whisper into the storm. And when you close your eyes, just before sleep takes you, you might hear it answer in the quietest way possible, a sigh that sounds very much like the word home. And so, in the softest hours of the night, when the world had hushed itself into the steady rhythm of falling rain, the house stood silent and awake. The valley was wrapped in mist, the air cool and scented with wet pine, the moon a pale blur behind drifting clouds. Inside, the last ember in the hearth glowed faintly, casting long shadows that moved like memory across the floor. The house had listened for so long that it no longer needed words. It understood everything through the language of sound, of weight, of silence. Every droplet against its roof was a sentence, every breath of wind a story retold. Time had ceased to matter. The years folded into one another like pages in a book too often read, the ink fading but the feeling eternal. The house had outlived the laughter of children, the warmth of families, the solitude of dreamers, and the hush of travelers who came seeking peace. It had been loved, left, forgotten, and found again. And through it all, the rain had never stopped coming. It was the one constant, the tender hand that wiped away dust, that kept the wood alive, that filled the nights with song. Sometimes, when storms were heavy and the thunder rolled across the valley like slow drums, the house felt almost human. Its walls trembled slightly, not in fear, but in memory. It could almost recall voices, the faint echo of Clara humming as she brewed tea, the murmur of strangers who found shelter, the quiet thank yous whispered before dawn. Each sound had soaked into the grain of the wood, into the fabric of the curtains, into the heart of the place itself. The house was full, not of things, but of presence. And on rare, crystal-clear mornings when the rain finally paused, the silence that followed was not emptiness but fulfillment. The air shimmered with the aftertaste of water, the soil glistened, and light streamed in through clean windows, soft and forgiving. Birds sang, their voices high and pure, like bells carried by wind. The house soaked in that stillness too, grateful in its own quiet way. It had learned that beauty did not live only in sound, but also in the spaces between, those precious, fragile pauses that made every drop meaningful. Legends of the house continued to drift from one place to another. Some said that on lonely highways, if you rolled your window down during a storm, you could hear a faint echo, a harmony of rain on glass that sounded just slightly alive. Others claimed that when they closed their eyes at night, the rain outside their window began to slow, as if waiting for them to listen. And maybe that was the truth of it, that the house had never been a place at all, but a feeling, one that lived on in anyone who had ever found peace in the sound of falling rain. In time, the valley changed. The forests grew thicker, the river carved new paths, and the road that once led to the house faded into moss and soil. But still, on rainy nights, something shimmered faintly where the house had stood, a soft, golden glow barely visible through the fog. Some swore they could see its outline, its windows flickering like the eyes of a memory. Others heard the creak of its old wooden door, or the whisper of a chair shifting, as though someone had just stood up to greet the rain. If you stood there long enough, you might feel it too, that sense of being seen, understood, held by something larger than yourself. The rain would fall gently against your shoulders, your heartbeat would slow to match its rhythm, and the noise of the world would melt away. For a moment, you would belong to that quiet, endless music. You would understand what Clara once felt, what all who had come before her had found. The peace of being part of something eternal, something that asks for nothing except that you listen. And when you finally turn to leave, the rain will follow you softly, its song stitched into your thoughts. You'll carry it wherever you go, the calm, the stillness, the quiet companionship of sound. Perhaps, on another night, far from that hidden valley, when the sky darkens and the rain begins again, you'll find yourself pausing, eyes closed, listening. And in that moment, the house will listen too. Because some places never truly end. Some homes are built not of stone or wood, but of echoes and remembrance, of hearts that learn to listen. And as long as there is rain in this world, somewhere, somehow, the house that listens to rain will still be there, alive in the hush between drops, in the breath before sleep, waiting for you to hear it once more.
And so, dear dreamer, our story finds its gentle close, but your night continues calm and unbroken. Let your thoughts drift, as lightly as clouds across a moonlit sky. Let your body sink, as deeply as roots into the quiet earth. There is no need to hold on, no need to listen further, only to rest. For the story remains with you, carrying you through the night, until morning's light comes softly to call. Good night, and sweet dreams. From the Midnight Library. Crescent moon sparkles, break time equals 2000/.